We're going to lead off this morning with the recipient last night of the inaugural K&L Gates Professorship of Ethics and Computational Technologies, Illah Nourbakhsh. Illah is the director of the Community Robotics Education and Technology Empowerment Lab. For those of you who were here last night, you heard him refer to the CREATE Lab. Now you know what the acronym stands for, which is focused on the development of community-based social and educational robotics and really transforming people's lives through community engagement to identify the challenges that people face in their lives and the ways that robotic and AI technologies can really address, respond to those challenges and then support people's abilities to achieve their goals. And over the years, the CREATE Labs programs have engaged over 40,000 people globally. So the reach is not simply here in the community, not simply on campus, not even simply in the United States, but reaches around the globe. Illah's been a CMU faculty member since 1997, is the author of 4 books, dozens of articles, and holds 13 patents, some of which were part of what led him to have a brief, I believe, career as a startup entrepreneur. He's been named a Kavli Fellow by the National Academy of Sciences, and in fact has been inducted into the, I want to make sure I get this right, the June Harless West Virginia Hall of Fame. So I think probably a distinction that is unique in this room. Following Illah's remarks, he'll be joined for a brief conversation by Tom Simonite, senior writer for Wired, who was previously the San Francisco bureau chief at MIT Technology Review, and has written and edited technology coverage at the New Scientist magazine. And now, in his current position at Wired, he covers artificial intelligence and its effects on the world. Without further ado, Illah Nourbakhsh.
Thank you. Well, thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction, and good morning, all. To loosen my jaw and set the stage, some true stories first. True story. I'm sitting in a room, there's ministers of transportation, ministers of defense, ministers of sports from various countries in the room, and the editor-in-chief of one of the biggest journalism newspaper companies in the world gets up and says, "We've been had by ourselves." When we published the first story outing fake news, I went online to see our fake news story. And on our online version of our website, there's our fake news story in the middle, and above it and below it, there was fake news. Because we were selling AdWords, and the people who bought and won the auction happened to be fake news purveyors. Immediately, and he said, you know, this is our own fault. We don't even know how to compensate our own investigative journalism without being part of a community that we're trying to say is a disaster. Immediately gets up the CEO of the biggest behavioral analytics company in the world and says, "I completely agree with what you just said. That was me. I did the article on top, and I did the article on the bottom. And guess what? I have a team of machine learning people who are amazing at what they do. My computers do hundreds of millions of A/B comparisons a day. And we know," this is a direct quote, "how to maximize dopamine response by people. And we know how to make a system that maximizes this and engages you and causes you to click through, and it makes me money. And I admit that it's not completely ethical, but it really works well. And I challenge any of you in this room to come up with a better way for me to make as much money, and I'll switch right away." Another story. A few years ago, a gentleman came back from war and started a bar, an Irish-themed pub in Atlanta. And it was in a transitional neighborhood where gentrification was happening. But there were people, homeless folks, on the sidewalk. And he didn't like this homeless presence on the sidewalk in front of his pub. So he built the world's first BumBot, B-U-M-B-O-T, robot controlled by him that would threaten people on the sidewalk with a high-pressure water cannon and a spotlight and a speaker. And it made the news stories. And the stories in the news, which fascinated me, were about the empowerment he had as a maker, inventing a whole new innovative product. Now, fast forward about 7 years, and last year, Nightscope started having this wonderful robot, Nightscope, which is a security guard that you can rent and have roam around your establishment. Nightscope was purchased by an establishment in San Francisco because the sidewalk in front of their establishment had so many homeless people on it. And so now we have a commercial robot used by an establishment to actually keep people away from their sidewalk. This is where the story can't be made up. It's too good to be fake. The establishment that bought Nightscope and used it to make sure homeless didn't congregate on the sidewalk in front of their establishment was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. No kidding. Go look this up. So the SPCA used a robot to intimidate people on the sidewalk until, by the way, San Francisco City Council made that illegal. Another one. We talk a great deal about war and robots and whether robots should, in a situation where there's a war going on, make decisions about taking human life. And it's an excellent and important argument to have, and there's some outstanding books on the subject. Meanwhile, in South Korea, one of the biggest electronics manufacturers in the world made a machine gun-activated turret that's completely autonomous, uses near-infrared to actually identify people and shoot at them. And it's used today to guard some actual retail establishments. And it's already installed today on the DMZ. And it's not one odd actor. There are multiple companies now doing this in South Korea, as well as in the Middle East. Now go back a few years ago. Let's talk about drones. Los Angeles was testing drones for one of the first times a few years ago. They had a drone up in the sky, cameras down, and the police were having a blast flying this thing around, just like your kids. Except when they're flying this thing around, just playing with it, they noticed pot. They noticed a whole marijuana plantation behind somebody's walls. They went, oh, look at that. What? So they go in and make arrests, and it goes all the way up to the state Supreme Court. Because the question is, they didn't have any right to search. They didn't have a warrant. Well, what the court said in the end was, you know what? Now that there are drones, our assumption to the right of privacy by having a high wall around our house actually no longer applies. Because drones are commonly available and they go above things. So you don't get your right to privacy assumed unless you happen to have a roof over your marijuana plantation. So it's kind of fascinating that the legal ramification was to change the rights we have around privacy because of a piece of technology that was boundary technology. And fast forward to a couple months ago, I was in a meeting with the Minister of Transportation in one of the biggest countries in the world, and we were taking questions from the audience about drones. And people were saying questions like, well, what's the regulatory infrastructure you're going to put in place to allow drones to fly? And the answer from the minister was, we have no idea. Somebody else asked, what about tort and liability? How are we going to deal with insurance around drones? Answer, we have no clue. Nearly every question the audience asked, the answer that was received by the audience from the Minister of Transportation for that country was, we have no idea. Okay, one final true story for you. Let's go to cars. Remember the cute Google car? It had no steering wheel. You remember that? It was steering free. Why? I think we need to revisit that question because it is very relevant to what you've been hearing about in the news today. So the reason it had no steering wheel is kind of interesting. They took a bunch of Toyota Priuses, and put the self-driving software in it in early days. We have to come up with some plural form for it, right? And then they trained Google employees to use these cars. And they put cameras in them to watch the Google employees and see what they do. And the engineers then reviewed the video footage of this. And they were gobsmacked. There would be an engineer who, on their first day on the highway from San Francisco down to Mountain View, are in the Google self-driving car, cameras there, and their baby's in the back seat in a little car seat. And you know what they're doing? They're like this the entire time. Goo goo gaga, oh, hi, you're so cute. The whole time on the highway. There was one guy, memorably, who spilled his coffee. So for 10 minutes, he was like this on the floor, trying to clean the floor, while the car's on the highway, barreling down the road. So what did Google do? They had a meeting, and they panicked. They said, holy buckets. People who we train, who are Google engineers, carefully selected for their raw intelligence and superiority, are doing what? They're completely trusting the car. Well then, the answer is obvious. We gotta get rid of the steering wheel. We can't trust people at all. That's why there was no steering wheel in the little cute Google car. Now, fast forward to the accidents you've heard about over the last few years. Dude in Tesla, watching Harry Potter, am I getting this right? watching a Harry Potter movie or listening to a Harry Potter audio drive, running into the side of a truck that if he was looking up, he would have seen. Person in car running into a bicycle, where the safety driver is clearly not paying attention for the couple of seconds before the crash. In a funny way, Google was right. Their attempted solution was removing the steering wheel, a very extreme point of view. The back step was, let's not bother with that actually, let's just leave it there and make sure people know, as Eric showed in his video, when people should just take over like that, as if people have the sudden attention to jump into a high-stress situation and react quickly. Which, by the way, is the opposite of how pilots work with autopilots. So what wasn't in the news in that case is how hard it is for all of these cars to see bicycles. Put a human on a bicycle and our nice thick legs make it obvious that we are there. But bicycles are a bunch of little thin frames, and the LiDAR goes right through them. And by the way, all those sensors the robots have are noisy. So when you have little frames reflecting a little bit of light, that's noise. If we were to actually see the bicycles, we'd be on a part of the curve that Eric showed where we'd have a huge number of false positives. So we avoid that by hoping to see their legs. But that means person walking with a bicycle is walking with an invisible stick, and that's a problem. So these are all true examples. And I want us to put on our physician's hats and be a physician for a second and say that these are symptoms. And the question I want to ask is, what are these the symptoms of? And I have a kind of hypothetical proposition for you about what these are. Because I believe these are all symptoms of one thing, and they're one odd thing that I don't think we've spent enough time talking about. I believe these are symptoms of alienation. We're creating a world in which we are alienating ourselves from the reality we're constructing. And there's three ways in which I believe we're doing this alienation. I want to talk about that. Now, the first one relates to robotics itself. AI in robotics fundamentally was born out of the desire to do mimesis, to mimic humanity. It was all about this question of what makes us tick and how do we cognitively create systems that tick the way we do. How do we replicate the human miracle in machine form? And that's mimesis. It's a one-to-one replacement of the human intelligence with something new. And maybe that's why they called it AI, which I agree 100% with Eric is kind of a bad name for it. The word artificial throws us off. Fundamentally, the first form of alienation I'm going to talk about is the alienation from mimesis itself. AI, the reality of what it is today, has alienated us from that very idea of a one-to-one relationship or one-to-one replacement hypothesis from person to artificial person. We aren't making artificial people by any stretch. In fact, if I look at the most successful AI systems today that I boast about and I am proud of, they have nothing to do with people. They don't work like people, they don't smell like people, they don't behave like people, but they solve world problems. I'm going to give you two quick examples to give you a sense of how different these systems are, how alienated from human mimesis. First, a system I love, done by Steve Smith right here in Carnegie Mellon University. East Liberty, all the traffic lights in this neighborhood have cameras on them now. And instead of having regular metric counters that decide how long the green light, red light episodes last, these cameras look at pedestrians and they look at cars. And they optimize beautifully across a network of dozens of lights the exact pacing of the red and green lights in such a way as to minimize idle time in cars and maximize pedestrian throughput. What you get is much, much faster pedestrian walking and much, much less particulate matter in the air from idling. It actually works. Something extraordinary, like I think 40% reduction in local pollution just from idling of cars. I mean, ridiculously cool results. But this is an intelligent network of cameras responsive to people and pedestrians. Is that a human? Is it replacing a human job? No, it has nothing to do with any task that a human had been sitting there doing. There are no gnomes sitting there hitting lights, turning lights green and red. This is a whole new category of action. I'll give you one more example that comes out of the old lab of Jeff Schneider and a number of other people at Carnegie Mellon, which is the ability to do behavioral analytics to discover dangerous situations. They did a very famous piece of work about 7 years ago, looking at purchasing habits in drugstores. And they were able to create systems that can, in advance, predict the onset of pandemics in the United States, like the cold virus, by changes in purchasing habits in drugstores. There was nobody doing that at the CDC like that, because it couldn't be done. It's a big data analytics problem, and they did it. And they took the same system, and today they use it for human sex trafficking. So they're able to actually find elements of human sex trafficking around the world by simply taking all of the communication media in the internet and analyzing them at massive speed. That does not replace anybody who's doing that work that way. Instead, it's not mimesis, but a whole new way of thinking about computational intelligence applied to a real problem. Now the second problem, the second kind of alienation. Alienation from failure. And this is a really big problem. We have an intuition for how humans fail. And with natural intelligence, we understand what failure looks like and what success looks like. And I just explained to you, success does not look anything like human success in the regime of robots and AI. But guess what? Failure looks nothing like human failure either. And yet, we have biases that make us try and suit the robot failure into the clothes of human failure. I'll give you a couple of examples from two friends of mine. Stuart Russell has an example he uses. He shows a picture. And in the picture, there's some people, and there's a market, and he uses one of the online image analysis tools, and it spits out a sentence. It says, a group of people buying vegetables at a fruit stand. And the people in the audience look at this and go, wow, that's awesome. That AI system really knows what's going on in that picture. Then you zoom in on the picture. There's no group of people. It's one person. There's no fruit stand. It's a bunch of green leaves. And yet to you, the human observer, when you look at that picture, you love it. Rod Brooks does an even better one. He shows a picture, and the computer says, a group of children playing Frisbee on grass. And then he asks the same system, because it is a group of children playing Frisbee on grass. That one actually gets it right. So then he asks the system, so can 6-month-olds play Frisbee? It has no idea. Do Frisbees taste good? No clue. How far do Frisbees fly? No idea. That sentence is there because of statistical analysis that made that sentence a construct associated with that picture. It doesn't mean that the computer has any clue what any of the individuated words in the sentence mean, or what the semantics of that sentence are in that particular case. And maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't. But we, the observers, have no idea if it does or it doesn't. And yet, our failing as humans is to imbue upon that computer meaning. Because it's using human language, so certainly it understands. Same problem I have with my colleagues who put eyes and ears and a smile on their robot. And then when it smiles, you imbue upon it affect, when that affect is literally Hollywood. So that's the second kind of failure, alienation from failure. The last one is actually the worst one in a way. When I got my PhD, we used to deal a lot with something called nonmonotonic reasoning. Humans make assumptions to make the world something we can deal with. We ignore irrelevant detail and think about relevant detail. And then we change our minds if something becomes relevant that we thought was irrelevant. Like, oh, my car's not starting, and I'm late for an appointment. Now I have to start worrying about my car not starting. But I don't spend all morning worrying about that until it becomes a real thing. So we sometimes call that things like the closed world assumption. We make an assumption that the world is what it is and it's kind of static until we have to change our mind. Well, the problem is we make that assumption about technology. When I see the boundaries of efficacy that a computer has, I assume that's what a computer can do. That's what AI is capable of. And I will always be wrong, because AI is dynamic. It is not static. And what it can do tomorrow is different from what it can do today. And our ability as a human populace to make hay of that does not exist. We don't understand how to think about a system whose capabilities change every day. And that's a fundamental problem, is that we have a static model of a dynamic system. So, diagnosis. If we are being alienated from this technology, in the case of success, in the case of failure, and by our inability to understand how it's moving, what is the diagnosis? Well, the diagnosis is very simple. We're AI illiterate. And by we, I don't mean the wonderful lawmakers and colleagues that I have in this room. I mean the human population. I mean those who have to engage in civic discourse nationally and internationally. So we're AI literate. And it matters now compared to 20 years ago because AI is actually changing the world, to its elections, to its marketing, and all the other ways in which AI changes the world. And it's funny, if you look at very, very fast financial trades, they change the world, but at least in a little way. We all read about it on Marketplace. The difference is these new AI systems, they change what humans do en masse. They change our behavior. So they're pushing back hard. I think the mistake got made a few years ago when we invented the phrase STEM. We really, really messed that one up big time. We invented the word STEM, and we said all our kids have to learn STEM. STEM is what matters. And we excluded the humanities completely, when what matters is social science applied to the computer science that we do. It's the combination of the two that lets us understand the world. And yet, STEM excluded that divisively. It also took all of these disciplines and created silos for them: science, technology, engineering, math, as if they're individual areas of learning that we can optimize and then we know what to do. And we don't. Because knowing anything about those four alone and not transdisciplinary doesn't allow us to understand the changes in robotics. So I'm at the final part of my talk. I've told you about the problems. The question is, what's our treatment? And I believe our treatment is actually that we have to future-proof ourselves to the dynamism of AI itself. We have to future-proof our population to the idea that artificial intelligence is a moving entity and that it will change. And I'll give you an example. Eric talked in his keynote speech yesterday about not just the fact that these systems have computational bias, but in fact, Microsoft's working on ways to overcome that bias. That's excellent. But I challenge you to show the fluency in the public to then ask the next question, which is, how will those corrective techniques be tested and audited? How will we know if they work or not? How can the public know that? They don't have the literacy, the fluency that we need for that. So fundamentally, I think we need the same kind of fluency for AI, for civic discourse, that today we have around, say, government. People know how the separation of power works in the United States. They know how elections work. They know what the Electoral College is. Everybody needs to have that undergirding of knowledge so that we can have civic discourse, so we can make decisions as a community. We don't have that undergirding of knowledge about AI, and that's a fundamental problem. So in conclusion, what I'm saying is that we need fluency. And what that means is we need to recombine a juxtaposition of AI and humanity. We need people to understand what humanity is, what are the ways in which AI is actually what I'm going to call alien intelligence. So I'll give you a new moniker. I'll keep the same acronym to make it easy. So instead of CI, I'm going to say it's alien intelligence. But I think we need the population to understand how alien that intelligence is, how unrelated to the human form or the human failings. And I'm going to give you an example and pose you with a final challenge. The example I'll give you that we've nailed recently is climate change. Climate change is social and it's systemic. And what the world has managed to do is come up with markers for changes in climate. The world has figured out ways to systematize the understanding of how climate change affects the world, both in terms of access to clean water, access to air, climate-induced refugees, political changes due to climate, and of course, nutritional gaps due to climate. We know how to visualize this. We know how to quantify this. And because we can do all that, we can look 40 years hence, show you the ways in which boundaries are being pushed in irreversible ways. And as a result, what do we have? We have the SDGs, the Strategic Development Goals from the UN. We have very explicit and clear boundaries along which governments can actually act together, because they can see the possible future that's poor if we don't do the right thing. So that is how we've dealt with climate change. It's a systematized approach that has quantified the externalities of how climate change affects humanity. We need this for AI. You know, if you take other ways in which we've changed human behavior, like the opioid drug epidemic, we're starting to quantify that because it's having such massive impact on society, like in West Virginia, where I do a great deal of work. But we need precisely this quantified, systematized understanding for the externalities, the ways in which AI changes society, so that we can show the boundary conditions and the needs and the curves where we have to act as a unified whole planet to enforce the changes that cause us to stay within a regime of control that's acceptable. That means democracy. That means personal agency. That means personal dignity. And my final point is, I have already said AI is dynamic. Fundamentally, this means if we don't do this, if we don't create for AI the same systematized approach with essentially strategic goals as we have for climate change, we are otherwise basically lobsters in a pot of warm water, and the water will gradually warm, and we'll accommodate to those changes ever so gradually, and we will change. And by the time the water boils, we'll have changed quite thoroughly and quite irreversibly. Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk, Illah. Let's sit down. We have a few minutes here. So your talk reminded me of something you said on stage yesterday at one point. You said that you were convinced that artificial intelligence would change our conception of humanity. And I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yes. I think there's two things that artificial intelligence does to us that it's dangerous if it's doing it to us and we're not recognizing that. First of all, it changes our sense of what humans are unique at and what we derive dignity from, the pleasure of dignity from. Secondly, artificial intelligence changes our sense of what's possible. You know, we're distracted so much by stories of things like immortality and singularity, precisely because they redefine our sense of who we might be one day. I have had CEOs visit me here who've popped a handful of pills during lunch at Alibaba, and I've jokingly asked this one gentleman, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm part of this life extension program for immortality. And he was serious. And when I jokingly asked him, so how do you deal with financial planning for that? He gave me the card of his financial planner and said, oh, I have a great guy, and he does Immortal Planning. Seriously. That's the humanity concept he has completely changed. You know, that's not a Bill Gates who wants to think about his legacy in terms of positive impact on the world. Mm-hmm. That's somebody who believes he's going to live forever. And that's the world we now live in, is with people that have that mindset and have levers of power.
Okay. And you have worked with AI and robotics for a long time and thinking about the consequences. Has that changed your understanding of humanity or your sense of yourself? I'm guessing you don't take pills to live forever.
No, I don't.
Right.
I think we need to make room for the next generation in general. Yes, I think my own sense of self has changed tremendously. I think I recognize that we're less good at understanding what we should be doing in the world than I used to believe. I used to believe it was very clear how we should have a career and how we should kind of forge a direction and have impact. But now what I see is a world that's changing around us quite rapidly and dramatically. I remember 20, 30 years ago feeling like the world's getting more peaceful, polarization's decreasing, things are kind of looking good, my kids are going to have a better life than me. I don't really feel that way anymore. I feel like we have a pathway that's rocky, and we have to do everything we can to keep ourselves from actually ending up in a worse place than we are in today.
Right. Okay. And you spoke at the end there about trying to look to the future, and think about how AI might change the world as being a useful exercise. And you indeed wrote a whole book that kind of took that approach, Robot Futures, and each chapter you wrote a little fictional skit looking ahead. We were talking about one of those earlier, which you titled it Mediocracy. Could you just introduce us to that?
Yeah, there's one that I called Mediocracy. The idea behind that title was, the story started with this idea that a company has an excess inventory of 50,000 green lawn chairs. And the way you deal with that in this conceptualized future 20 years from now, I didn't realize it was now, is you run your behavioral analytics system, create bespoke marketing copy for every individual human being on Earth that maximizes the chance that they want to buy a green lawn chair. And you, overnight, sell your inventory. And it's interesting because the tail's wagging the dog. You're no longer building and selling product that people need. You're simply controlling the need of people with a giant universal remote to make sure they buy whatever you have excess inventory of. And then the point I made was that if we look not just at consumer choice, but voter choice, what happens when people are able to create highly bespoke copy for each individual person that maximizes the chance they vote for the candidate who's paying the most money for that marketing? Well, this is now happening. I called it Mediocracy because at some point, personal agency has been reduced to the point where it's hard to any longer call the system democracy. It's difficult to use that word with a straight face when, in fact, people's political choices are not really being controlled directly by their brain, but by a system that consists of their brain and very carefully customized marketing copy.
Okay. So it's an unequal fight, right? You have this big analytic machinery working against your small biological system. What can we do about that? Have you any thoughts about how we can level the playing field and allow us to continue to be real actors in reality?
I loved Oshunde's talks yesterday in his spotlight speech. I love the idea of redress. I think actually that's a really important point. I think the general data privacy protection regulations that Europe is putting in place are something we should be emulating in the US. I believe we have to create really deep understanding of the ethics of AI and humanity, basically from lower school, middle school, high school, all the way through college, so that the next generation of engineers, politicians, and civic leaders actually understand this boundary technology. And I think we need disclosure. You know, the forms we signed today, the opt-ins are a complete joke. So I think we need fundamentally to rethink how we disclose the ways in which we're manipulated online. The idea that the biggest marketer can get up and actually talk about dopamine in the view of the public and not feel embarrassed about doing that is remarkable. That's drug design. It's exactly the same as designing drugs for addiction. And it's become okay to talk about that.
Right, okay. And you spoke about this failure of intuition that people tend to have for artificial systems. You know, we have a tendency to anthropomorphize and project a little bit. Do you have an idea of how we can change that tendency at a large scale? Like, can we, I don't know, maybe we just haven't had enough time to learn an intuition for how these machines operate or fail, as you highlight?
I actually think that's something that's on some of you, the journalists, and I think you can do an outstanding job of that. I believe, you know, sometimes I talk and people say, well, we can't make everybody a computer scientist. Yeah. I think there's a huge, huge area in the middle between making somebody a computer scientist and leaving them illiterate. Mm-hmm. I think there's really outstanding ways in which we can teach people the failings of these machines, show them how the computational bias, for instance, causes errors in decision making. And we can, I think, teach a lot that stops far short of having to force upon them getting a PhD in the subject. Right. So I think it's education, and I think it's investigative journalism that can do that. Of course, the irony is we have rapidly falling funding for investigative journalism. So instead, we have people who don't get monetized, like the old Huffington Post writers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you also talked about, another failure you talked about was this failure of mimesis. So you said that the field started out trying to do that and hasn't managed it. Can we get back to it? Do we want to? Is it something that we should desire?
It's an interesting question. You know, I have colleagues who are trying to make, quite literally, babies. The idea is if I make an artificial baby, then I can raise it, and it'll become human in ethical, normative behavior. There's a whole hypothetical there that people hew toward. I don't know, in a value judgment sense, that we need to do mimesis. I don't know that we need to replace people one-to-one. The biological desire to understand how humans work is absolutely outstandingly important and interesting, and we should always go toward that. Cognitive orthotics will benefit from that. So our ability to help people have quality of life as they grow old is going to be directly impacted by our ability to do that. It's not so much that the fact that we've hewed away from mimesis is bad, as it is we have a tendency to assume that that robot replaces a human, when in fact it's utterly alien to us. Mm-hmm. And unless we train people to understand that, I don't think they'll ever have the skin to accept that. Okay.
And we have time for one more question. I'm going to borrow one from you. Yesterday on this stage, you said that everyone had to answer 3 questions. We have time for just one of them. So one of your questions was, think 10 years into the future. What is something that you are very excited about AI making possible that would improve the world in some way? You know, maybe you could take us out on a high note here.
That's a great question. So actually, the quality of life of an individual human is probably the thing that I'm most excited about. And so when I look at everything from exoskeletal structures that would allow somebody to walk who, were they to fall, it would be a huge change in quality of life. But if this system allows them to walk, use their musculature, and if they start falling, it catches them. You know, I love that idea. I love the idea of extending people's personal sense of agency and empowerment. And you can apply that in this biological sense of, you know, muscular exoskeletons, and you can apply this in a cognitive orthotic sense. The idea that you can have cognitive systems that work with a human, not to replace their thinking, but to help them keep thinking even as their thinking degrades, I think is powerfully important to our own ability to age gracefully and age well. So to me, that's the thing where I believe those technologies, both on the cognitive side and on the muscular skeletal side, actually will come of age in the next 10 to 15 years. And it's a sea change, right? I could go for a walk with my great-grandfather, a hike up a trail at Yosemite, which would be unthinkable today. And that, I think, is very inspiring.
Wonderful. OK. Nice to think about the positive. Illah, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.